So hello everyone and welcome back. This week we're going to be doing a little canal. Now it's a little bit more complicated than the original demos that I've been doing with you, so I want to break it up into two lessons. So I'm going to just talk about reflections first before we start painting. When you get water, there is a line above and below where you see the edge or the end of that water. Obviously at the beach it's the horizon, but in a lake or a pond or a canal you have limitations. So there might be a building here and it'll have so if we are on the water, then we can assume that everything that is above the water is reflected directly below. So these distances will stay quite true. So I've photocopied this and now I'm simply going to flip it down and I'm looking at this baseline. That's my water line. So just place that down, make sure, and because I didn't draw with too much accuracy, it's a little bit out, but you get the picture that what is above is exactly reflected below. Now, if it's a still pond, if it's canal, there's no water on the surface making ripples, that's fine. That's exactly what we would paint. If it's a slightly windy day, then we're going to add reflective movement on the surface of the water. So we will do a little bit of that just today. I'll show you a few images. My sister was recently there and she took some photos, and because it was a windy day when she was there. But I guess the main thing I want to take away from this is today we are working from something that's on the water level, because if we were up very high and the water was a little bit further away from our building, so there was a grassy bank and the grass was here and we were reflecting this, then the rules of reflection will change, and even though that is a true reflection there, we won't be reflecting from there, we'll be reflecting from here, if you can understand that. So things change all the time when you're working with reflections. Okay, let's get to drawing up our painting. So I'm using Blue Violet Lake, which is my Derwent watercolour, and it's just like a softer purple, bluey purple, so I will draw quite heavily with it. You'll have to let me know in the comments if any of you have ever been to this part of the world, lucky enough. I have been to Venice many years ago, 1993 was. I backpacked around Europe by myself. Before mobile phones, it was a different world. Beautiful place to visit. And yeah, as I said, my younger sister was recently there on a Europe trip, and this is one of her photos. So we've got scenery in the back, obviously. I'm not going to be too concerned about that right now, because what I want to do in this lesson is get this bridge drawn in and talk about the reflection of it. I have got the boat I've drawn in here. Whether you want to add this in or not, it's up to you, because the perspective of this boat, because we're sitting in it, is quite full on. It's subtle but quite complicated. It's up to you. It doesn't really have to be in the picture if you don't want it to be. So now we have this reflection. So because this is the line of where the water is hitting the underside of the bridge. So over here we're seeing that, I'd line that up, and then that's going to come down to wherever we're meeting here. Be quite sharp. Remember, at some point this line is going to meet up with this line and around our height of eye line, so that's going to be our horizon line, and that would be our vanishing point. If I wanted to put other boats along here, they'd be angling towards, and the bottoms of the buildings in the distance will be angling along to that. A good way to do this is if you get a pencil and you trace it. And I'm pressing really, really heavily with my watercolour pencil here. And then I put it this way. I don't know if you can see through that, but lift it up if you can't and just check, line them up. And then if you press really heavily, you flip over, you're making a very soft little imprint on that. So it's actually giving you a really quick little helpful guide. Oh, you can't see it, but I can, so that's the main thing. And mine's going to come down. Oh, that's a bit wrong. Sorry. So let's get started. I've pre-wet my palette. You can either spray it or just dip your brush in clean water and add water to those squares of colour that you might use. So what I want to start with is the brickwork. I'm not going to do the top of the painting today, but we're going to start with the bridge, the top of the brickwork, and allow for the greenery that is growing on it. So I want to use my burnt sienna, and I'm doing wet on wet. I've applied quite a bit of water, and I want a sharp line at the top. So see how I'm purposely placing the weight of my colour. My brush first touches underneath. I'll leave this little bit in here, maybe dash a little bit in here and there, and then over here again. Wet that a bit more. Now I'm going to add a bit of the orangey red, purely because I want to have that more sort of more vibrant orange brick colour. And here the paper is not so damp, so I'm actually the boss of where this colour is sitting. Lightening it as I go out. Over here I may, I'll just test how wet it is. It's still quite damp, so I'm just going to dip straight into my orangey brick colour. Now I'm leaving gaps of paper purely because I've got some vine to add in. And I can build up my orange in small areas, shadowy areas later if I feel like I want to. But that's about all I need to place in for now. When you start out with watercolour, you may feel you have to cover everything, and it's just a beginner thing. You don't have to. So now you can see into the wet, I'm adding the darkest of my greens, my shadowy green. And I'm actually keeping that along the bottom to allow the sunlight to hit the green at the top. And this side I'll allow to dry a little bit more because it's actually going to be a fine little vine growing down the side here on this side, so I don't want it to run too much. And I'm going to go into my more of a mid-tone really. Remember, it's important to leave some gaps and not just colour straight in from the dark to the light green. And add in the lighter tones at the very end. You can always go back and darken your darks, but you want to leave your lights as light as possible, and even little bits of plain paper at times. So that's still a bit too wet, my mid-green's pulling into that, so I'm just going to leave that for a little minute. Now the bridge has this white, it's like a concrete capping here. It's very difficult sometimes to figure out how you should go with your whites, but I always err on the side, is it warm or is it cool? So for this instance, I want it to feel warm, so I've gone to just a murky brownish colour and very, very runny or weak. I'm not wetting the page first because I want this to kind of just sit in one area and not bleed around too much. So I'm just going to touch the bottom around doesn't have to be perfect. It's going a little tiny bit greenish. That's because of my blue pencil that I've used. So what I'm doing is I'm washing out the colour, I'm patting the moisture out of the brush, and then I'm using that to suck up excess on my paper. And this is something I do quite often. Clean the brush and rub. See how flat it's a sand shoe, not a stiletto. My bristles are very low to the paper, which means they're leaving not much of a mark. Or you can press down heavy and just pull that colour around. But that's going to give me at the moment a nice little bit of depth in that. Now, underneath here is quite dark, so I want some movement in here, so I'm going to wet it first. Stay inside the borders of this area with the water, especially on the far underside edge here. I do not want to protrude out past that line. Don't worry if it does, because we have to paint this back section later, and you'll be able to cover over some things if you choose a darker building colour. Mind my wobbly hand. So I'm going to my little ultramarine blue, which remember is the cool blue, the distance colour. It recedes away from the eye. And I'm also going into my Payne's grey, which is, it's almost like a Prussian blue. It's a blue with black added. And between those two, I'll get my darkest darks in here. And I'm going to aim for having my darkest darks right at the back. So this is the bottom arch, bottom curve that we're working on. Be my heaviest marks. Sort of up a bit higher where it's truly shaded away from the light. I'm going to add in a tiny bit of my brown and bring that in towards this front section. So my purpose for this is literally creating depth within that shape. So it's no longer a shape, but it's going back. If you feel like you want to increase that, simply add in more colour with less water in it. So here I can really darken this just by adding more colour into that wet paint, working it. I feel like it's maybe a touch too blue, so I'm going to just dip into my brown, and probably a bit much, but that doesn't matter. And again, that same technique, pulling even the colour out. That just means that you're reducing the intensity of the colour, but you're not taking too much out. You're just moving it around a little bit. And I'm happier with that. Now again, if this wasn't a video, I would be moving this paper around to suit the curve of my hand, which is the exact opposite of where it is now. I'd be doing it this way, because that naturally gives you a better, more controlled curve. But just for the purposes of the video, I'll keep it fixed. I'm leaving that softness there for the moment. I may want to go in and darken that as I go, but for now I'm actually okay with that. Now down the bottom, you'll notice I've left this light on purpose. I'm actually going to pick up a little bit of green here and very gently add it into the drying paper, and also a tiny touch of the orange. I'm not really mixing them too much, I'm just letting them sit there together, as long as I'm filling in those light bits, and that will make sense a little bit down the track. That can be as rough as you want it to be, okay? Now, for the purposes of this, I'm going to wet this area but slowly start to just add colour where the reflection is. So I'm going to actually wet here. You can see that because my water's slightly coloured. And I'm not going to do anything to this area. It's just so long as it doesn't give me a really severe edge, I guess. But what I want you to notice is how I'm cutting in a zigzag sideways action. So what I've got there is that really just a little bit of the runny Payne's grey on my bristles, and I'm using that with a lot of water to make this stain on the page, and that's all it really is at this stage, is a stain on the page. I'm going to show you a technique now which I've used for beginners before, because it's less intense and less busy, less to think about, because you're really only using one colour at the time. So I'll bring this around here so you can see it a bit better. This is my Payne's Grey. Okay. And I'm getting it like quite intense, which means less water, more colour. And I'm actually going to just start painting onto the dry paper with it. You can see it looks pretty dark. Don't worry about it. But I don't want a neat line. I'm working in a very horizontal zigzag line like this. So you need a round brush with a nice tip, and that's the action. You can see how I'm using my hand isn't touching the page. I'm hovering over the page, and that's all I'm doing, and I'm guided by these lines that I drew earlier, and I'm leaving gaps. You can see that I'm leaving white paper gaps. I'm going out. The maximum is this reflected line here. It's a bit confusing, that one. But I don't want to go straight. I'm not drawing a line, I'm zigzagging. Now you can go the whole distance as well if you want. Make sure they're not too thick. Make sure you've got some nice thin ones in there, or even slightly separated ones. And this continues all the way. Now you see how dry the page is? You don't want it too dry, so I'll dip into the water once more, back into my colour. I don't want really rough marks like that. All my lines should be clean and sharp. But hopefully you'll be aware of how strong the colour is. You can build it up, but it's really better if you have an intense colour from the beginning. You don't want it too overworked. And if you don't have the boat, you won't worry about this bit, but if you do, you don't want to go over the boat. And then back. And if you're not sure, just leave it rather than work it too heavy. You don't want it to be solid. There's nothing you can do about it if you go too heavy. Okay, and then I'm going to let that dry. Let's go back up and work on finishing the planting. I've got my greenery in dark and mid-tones. Now I'm just going to add in my lightest greens. I'm just dulling it down a bit because I don't want it to overtake the water reflections. I might add in. And sometimes it's good to use a mix of colours and just to see how it goes. Watercolours should always be, you know, a percentage of experimentation, and not just picking one green, putting it on, picking another one, putting it on. You know, add in warm colours and cool colours and get, you know, 50 different shades of green. That's the fun in it, because then you add water and it will move again, it'll change colour because the colour underneath is influencing it. So I encourage you to experiment with your colours and shapes. You might want to keep this really soft and add a lot more water than I've got, because I've allowed mine to dry now and I'm quite happy with it being sharper. But if you want it to look more blurred, then obviously you would just add more water before you add this lighter green. I'm not going over the top one, I'm leaving that edge till next week so we can then play around with it a bit more. But now I can drag this down a little bit more over the top. And I might do some swirly randomness to make it look more like vines. Remember, see how I'm rotating the tip of the brush between my thumb and my pointing finger? that gives me randomness in case that your brush that you use has a bias tip and you're always making the same mark. So I'll leave that for now. Then what I want to do is leave the reflection of this light section, which is white or concrete, and I just want to go outside of that and wet it. Doesn't matter that I've got a little bit of green in my brush, but I'm not going to perfectly wet that edge. I'm going to go in the same horizontal shape as I've done. I'm sorry about the background noise, but I had an accident during the week and I haven't been able to record the voice separately, which I quite often do now because my unit's so noisy at times. So hopefully the sound on here is okay because it's all I've got the time to do at the moment. So I'm really roughly just wetting all of that area in. Now I'm going back to my Payne's Grey, which remember is just your black and blue, dark blue, like a navy. But I'm actually going to add my dark green into it just a little bit. So that's the colour I've got. Now if I add a little bit more green, see how it's subtle? And I'll show you here the normal Payne's Grey. So I've just pulled it away from blue into a more of a very subtle greeny grey blue, and water it a little bit more, and that's the colour for the base of my foreground water, the water that the boat is sitting on. It's got to be light and soft and a little bit dull. It should not be darker in tone than the first reflective area that we've already placed in. It should not go heavier than that. And I've got my hand off the page again, and I'm leaving, look at the areas of plain paper that I'm leaving. Okay, that's important. When I do the next half of the video, I want to show you about colour matching as well. So I'm going to leave it there for today because we're going to go over all of the water next time and unify it. But if you can have a go at this stage, I think it's enough for one hit, and I will see you in the next one to finish this one off. Thanks for joining me, and let's be creative. Bye.